Welcome back, everybody. This is Carl Pilz. In this video, I'm going to answer one question. Are fat and cholesterol bad for our health? In the last video, we had the question, isn't fat bad for us? Because I was saying that appetite is controlled by fat, so we need to increase the amount of fat that we're eating. But everybody in the world is telling us that fat is bad for our health. Everybody is telling us that fat clogs our arteries. So is this true? Let's start with a little history. Where did this whole notion that cholesterol is bad for us come from? To get to the beginning, we have to go back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, there was a steep rise in heart attacks. People were dying at a much increased rate than they were in the 30s and 40s from heart attacks. Then, President Eisenhower had a heart attack while he was in office, and this caused even more national interest. President Eisenhower, after he got out of office, died of a heart attack. So now everybody was panicked, and they wanted answers. What was causing all these heart attacks? Then in 1953, along comes a guy named Ancel Keys, a physiologist, who proposed that he had an answer. He said that he did what he calls the 7-country study, which he showed that in 7 countries, the countries that had the most cholesterol had higher incidence of heart disease. And of course, pharmaceutical companies loved this idea because even back then, they knew that they had drugs that could lower cholesterol, so they knew they could make money on it. And today, statin drugs are the #1 moneymaker for all pharmaceutical companies. One point that I want to make clear is that this 7-country study by Ancel Keys is the basis of all fat and cholesterol recommendations made by the government today. All doctors are given guidelines on how to treat people with different levels of cholesterol based on this 7-country study. So what's the problem, somebody could ask? The problem is that Ancel Keys didn't study 7 countries. He studied 22 countries. And then he cherry-picked the countries that he used in his study. This is the graph that Ancel Keys presented in his study. On the horizontal axis, you have the fat calories as a percentage of their total caloric intake. On the vertical axis, you have the deaths per 1,000 people. Now let's only look at the top line, which represents people aged 55 to 59, because the next graph I'm going to show you shows the same age bracket. But in this graph, it shows a pretty good correlation of fat calories compared to heart disease. But what does this graph look like when we include all 22 countries, not just the 7 that Ancel Keys decided to include? Well, it looks like this. This is the data for all 22 countries that Ancel Keys had available to him. And you can see it's a lot more scattered. But what Ancel Keys did is he took the countries that would make his results look the way that he wanted them to look. And he drew a line. And that is what he presented. But what about all the countries down here? These countries eat a lot of fat, and yet their heart disease is low. So how do you explain these countries? So what Ancel Keys did was, he didn't explain them. He just threw them out, and assumed that nobody would ever look. This is how our cholesterol guidelines were developed, and they were developed based on a complete fraud. Anybody who has ever done research will tell you that you cannot just throw out data because you don't like it, and that's exactly what he did. So didn't anybody catch this? I mean, people aren't idiots. Well, there were plenty of people who caught this. There was a doctor in Great Britain named Malcolm Kendrick who looked at the same 22 countries, but he chose a different 7 countries than what Ancel Keys did. And he was able to show that you can make a graph that shows that the more saturated fat people ate, the less their incidence of heart disease. There was also a British doctor and nutritionist named John Yudkin. He did a far more comprehensive piece of research, and he showed that it's not fat and cholesterol that are the problem. He showed that sugar is the culprit. He wrote a book back in 1972 called Pure, White, and Deadly, where he details the effects that sugar has on the body and shows that that is the primary driver of heart disease. But the problem was that when Keyes came out and presented his 7-country study, which he did on the 3 major networks of TV at the time, this caused him to become very popular. Later on, he became very politically powerful. And when Yudkin started criticizing his results and started saying that it was sugar, Ancel Keys criticized Yudkin and labeled him a quack. And so anybody who came along and started talking about sugar or anything other than cholesterol as the driver of heart disease, they immediately became labeled a quack. So that is where the notion that cholesterol is bad for us got started. Where is it now? Well, Ancel Keys ended up joining the National Institutes of Health, and he started what's now called the National Cholesterol Education Program. This is the committee that develops recommendations for doctors on how they should prescribe statin medications and other treatments for people with high cholesterol. There's a panel of quote-unquote experts who come up with these recommendations. Now I have a question for you. If there is a panel of people who are deciding how to treat us in order to make us the most healthy, do you think that the people on that board should be on the payroll of pharmaceutical companies? Now what if I told you that there were 9 people that developed the guidelines for how to treat high cholesterol? What if I told you that 8 out of those 9 people are being paid by between 7 to 10 pharmaceutical companies? Do you think that that's right? I don't. Here, we'll take a look. I'll show you exactly where to find it yourself.